And welcome back to By the Way, Broadway Baptist Church's podcast for our 18 and under ministries as we go through the gospel project together over the next 3 years. I'm Pastor Justin, and joining me today are Celeste, our ministry director over the nursery and preschool, Jackson, our ministry director over middle school, and Lauren, our ministry director of kids, children, somewhere between nursery and middle school.
That's me.
And today we are continuing the story of Moses and the people of Israel as they Vamanos, as they get out of Egypt and make their way to somewhere else. And so we looked at last week the 10 plagues, kind of, depending on what ministry you were in. If you were in the kids or the nursery, you looked at more of those plagues. If you were in the middle school or high school, you really focused on that last one, the Passover. And we looked at the gospel implications, how that points us directly to Jesus Christ and him being our Passover lamb, that perfect sacrifice for our sin so that God's wrath passes over us. Well, today we're not moving too far forward in the story, not really skipping too much. We see that after the Passover, after that 10th plague, when the firstborn of Egypt were all killed for not following God's decree, for not listening to his command and his prophecy and his judgment, Pharaoh said, "Get out, go, please, take all of this gold with you. Please, just get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. Go worship like you asked a long time ago. Pray for me. Get out of here." And so Israel takes off. And Israel is not just a group of 70 anymore. It's estimated that there are maybe as many as 2.5 million people that are now evacuating Egypt. No longer slaves, no longer in bondage, but they are going to worship their God and fulfill the promises that he gave to Abraham. But it's not a linear straight line story. We're not ready to say right off into the happy ending yet. There are other things that are going to happen. And that's what we're going to be looking at this week. As we look at our lesson, the title is "The Lord Will Fight for You." So after flying through those 10 plagues, after God delivers them, then they kind of take a detour. God doesn't take them directly in the shortest path possible to the land where he has promised them. For one reason, because the Israelites would have been scared. It says that they avoided the land of the Philistines because if they came across that warring people, then they would have been afraid. They were not a war-hardened people at this point. They hadn't gone to battle with anybody. So God takes them around there and leads them out into what seems like a dead end. They make it to the Red Sea, and the people immediately begin complaining. They say, "Moses, did you take us all the way out here because there wasn't room to bury us in Egypt?" And he says, babies. "Be quiet," or something to that effect. But in the meantime, Pharaoh's mind changes. He says, "Get out of here. I don't want you here anymore. Oh, by the way, I'm coming after you. I've changed my mind." Well, he thought he changed his mind. The Lord changed his mind, and he sends out 600 of his choice chariots to chase down. You like that alliteration? That's pretty good, right? Bears beats Battlestar Galactica. Anyway, he sends out his choice chariots to chase down Israel, and they are pinned between water. Drowning doesn't sound good. And the fierce chariots of Egypt. Dying doesn't sound that great to them either. And so they wonder, what are we going to do? And that's where we're going to pick up today. For God's glory, they're trapped between a chariot and a wet place. That's what we're going to rename this podcast. Just so corny it might work. Anyway, let's just press on. We're going to pretend we meant to say that. Celeste, how are you going to present this to the nursery kids this week?
All right, so our story point for this week is that God performed miracles and rescued his people. So a lot of times for our preschool lessons, we're always going to primarily be focusing on what the story tells us about God as opposed to ourselves. Our littles are still learning. Don't have a ton of life experience yet or are doing many things, but they are just learning about who God is. So we really focus on how God led this whole caravan of people and how he brought them out of Egypt. He protected them from Pharaoh's army. He's the one that parted the Red Sea, that he rescued them, which ties in really well with our key passage for this unit, which is God hears and rescues. So God heard the cries of his people, and in his timing, he rescued them from Pharaoh. So we're going to talk about just how he was the one that was pushing all of this along, that he brings us sometimes on paths that seem really different than what we expect, but it's always within his perfect plan. And we're going to see how he works and how he is faithful and how he is always our provider in that.
Very good. So just reminding our kids that God hears, he rescues, and he takes us on the path that he wants to, and we get to live that grand adventure, not necessarily knowing the next step, but knowing who is leading us on the way there. That's awesome. What about you, Lauren? How are we introducing this to the kids?
Yeah, so our session is titled Moses Parts the Red Sea, which objectively is a good title, but I already talked to my Sunday school teachers. I'm like, I really feel like it should say God parts the Red Sea, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's so evident in every little detail of this story that it is God who is working and controlling and orchestrating situations to bring about his glory and the protection of his people. So similar to the pre-K, our main idea is that God performed miracles to rescue the Israelites, but we're taking that one step further. We're adding, and they worshiped him in response. So what is our response to God's rescuing? Well, it should be worship. And we see that even from Exodus 7. I mean, these are some of the little sovereign details throughout. I mean, Exodus 7:16, God tells Moses, go and talk to Pharaoh and say, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. Well, here is exhibit A of that already in play as they're going through the Red Sea. And so, we're going to look at a lot of the details about this situation and how, even though the Israelites were scared and fearful, it was so evident that God was working on behalf of them throughout every little detail that played out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. And then, Jackson, how are we going to introduce this to our middle and high schoolers?
Yeah, so once again, we're going to make a little bit of an adjustment on our points and kind of make it a little bit more God-focused, God-centric, just like the kids in the preschool have already done. But we're going to talk about how God's deliverance is often different or looks different than what we expect or how we would have envisioned it. And just like the Israelites probably would not have envisioned their being rescued from Egypt as probably not being led through the land of the Philistines, which God didn't do, but probably also not being led to an ocean with no boats, with an army chasing behind them. That's probably not what they thought when Moses told them God's going to rescue us. And so how we're going to break it down, our points are going to be that first, God's deliverance is beyond our ability. Okay, so it wasn't up to the Israelites to figure out how to cross the Red Sea. And it wasn't up to the Israelites to turn around and fight the Egyptians who were chasing them in their 600 chariots. It was up to the Lord. And just like you said, Lauren, all across this story, it is like at every turn, it's God's sovereignty that is leading them along. It's God's sovereignty that's protecting them. We see that God in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, he's going before the Israelites. But then when the chariots are behind them, the angel of the Lord moves behind the Israelites. And so he's before them, he's behind them. He is the one moving, he's the one working, he's the one fighting at every step. It's not the Israelites. But that doesn't mean that they just sit there in the desert and do nothing. God is leading them along, and they have to take a step to follow them. So that's our second point, is that God's deliverance requires a response from us. And just like the Israelites had to respond when God, not Moses, parted the Red Sea, the Israelites had to step into the sea. They had to trust that God was holding those waters open so that they could walk through, and they had to trust that God was going to protect the behind them when the chariots were chasing them. So, yeah, God is in control, and he requires a response from us.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to beat the dead horse for a second.
Do it.
And we'll be out of Exodus after a while, and you won't have to hear this anymore. But I think sometimes, at least my envisioning of reading the story before and reading back over, Exodus really 12 through 15 this week, I saw something a little bit different, or at least that reminded me of something that I hadn't remembered before. I think sometimes we see maybe in film or in narrative that Israel just makes it across the Red Sea in the nick of time, and the chariots are chasing them, and they just barely get out of the water, and then whoosh, God lets the waters come back down. No, the chariots made it to them. And, as you mentioned, this pillar of cloud confuses them, makes it where they cannot actually finish that attack. Israel's not sitting there, running as fast as they can and just barely escaping in the nick of time. God confounds the Egyptians that are chasing them.
It says he causes their chariots to ride heavy, like where they're sinking into the sand.
Yeah, and so that's God's doing. That's not Israel just getting away and being crafty. The Red Sea didn't just part immediately. I think in my mind sometimes it's like, whoop, God just opens a window, the floor is dry, they run across, no big deal. No, it says that all night long the water begins to stack up and pile up and the wind blows and they cross on dry ground. Can you imagine? I mean, just waiting for this water to crush you on one side or the Egyptians to break through this cloud on the other. Not to mention the fact that, how amazing this is that there's a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, and it's all brand new to the Israelites. It's a lot scarier, I think, maybe from their perspective than we give credit. We just, those Israelites and their lack of faith again. I can imagine. Then they have to actually, like we said, walk across and look up at these towers of water on both sides. I mean, it's terrifying to think about.
Yeah.
I can hold my breath for a good 10, 15 seconds. I think if this water comes down, I'm dead immediately. It's bad news. By the way, did you know that there is something called a fluvial tsunami? Now, this doesn't really have much to do with the Exodus. I'm not saying that's what happened here. This is a miracle. This is a miracle. We're not trying to give some natural explanation for it. But it reminded me of an event that did happen in more recent history in the mighty Mississippi River. You see, starting at the end of 1811 into 1812, the New Madrid fault line and that general area experienced over 3,000 earthquakes, many of them magnitude 8.5 and higher.
Wow.
Until on one disastrous day, February 7th, 1812, the Mississippi River actually ran backwards. A tsunami formed in the Mississippi. The water goes the wrong direction, and all kinds of crazy things happen. I didn't write down all of these, but just from memory. You had things called sand blasts, which are basically spewing things of sand like volcanoes. You had tar balls that are popping up from the earth. You had something called ground light, where quartz crystals get squeezed so much that they begin to emit light. Trees are falling, things are crashing, waterfalls formed in the Mississippi River. And steamboats were going the wrong way.
Man.
Water's a scary thing. Let me read this to you. Just a little excerpt from a certain history website, and it says this: the strongest of the tremors followed on February 7th. This was one estimated at an amazing 8.8 magnitude, a reading that ranks among the strongest quakes in human history. Church bells rang in Boston. Do you know where the Mississippi River is? It's not near Boston.
No.
Church bells rang in Boston, thousands of miles away from the shaking. Brick walls were toppled in Cincinnati, and the Mississippi River water turned brown, and whirlpools developed suddenly from the depressions created in the riverbed. That's terrifying. Waterfalls were created in an instant. In one report, 30 boats were helplessly thrown over falls. The people on board passed away. Many of the small islands in the middle of the river, often used as bases by river pirates, didn't know that was a thing, permanently disappeared. Large lakes, such as the Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee and Big Lake at the Arkansas-Missouri border, were created by the earthquake as river water poured into new depressions. Rivers are terrifying. It would have been terrifying to cross the Red Sea. It would have been terrifying to see God part the waters in this way, but he does what is physically impossible. That is not what is naturally impossible, and parts the sea for them, protects them along the way, gets them across into safety, away from these trained professional killers that are chasing them. That's pretty amazing. And if we think that anyone but God did it, then we're dead wrong.
Yeah,
Right.
well, in the Red Sea, I mean, I did some research, and at its widest, it's like over 200 miles wide.
goodness.
Isn't that insane? Like, this is not a little lake that we see,
No.
like, down the road at
Yeah,
Sardis.
they didn't just drain Arkabutla and go across. That's right.
Yeah, like this was a massive miracle. And so, I mean, yeah, it's just crazy. Well, and something else, I mean, you were talking about details that were new to you in reading. Something that stood out to me reading this is in chapter 14, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp next to the Red Sea. For Pharaoh will say the people..." of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. And so this whole like conniving plan, like they were not going in that direction. And God tells Moses to turn back, literally, and go and encamp and make it look like y'all are trapped in. And we'll set this trap, like y'all are going to be the bait for Pharaoh, pretty much. And so, I mean, even the Lord's hand in that was a new detail that stood out to me reading it this time that I thought was really neat. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. So God orchestrates the plan, he orchestrates the trap, and then he orchestrates the rescue of Israel. You know, such an amazing event. And this story is going to be told well ahead of Israel as they wander in the wilderness, and we'll get there eventually. By the time they make it to Jericho, and I know we mentioned this last week, Rahab knows. She knows who God is, and Jericho is completely terrified because they know what he has done to the Egyptian army at the Red Sea. And so he is making a name for himself. God doesn't need any more glory than he has. He is all self-sufficient, but he is letting everyone know, I am the Lord, your God, the God of Israel, and I deserve all glory and honor and praise. And here we come. And so it's an amazing event, an amazing thing to think about. As we switch gears a little bit, how can we bring this home to our families? How can we have these discussions with our kids, with our spouses, with our dogs? I don't know who you're having discussions with on a day in and day out, but hopefully you're having discussions with someone. Going back to some of those tried and true questions we've talked about before, let's just discuss these at the table. What do we learn about God from this passage, from this narrative?
God works for his own purposes. If God would have done what the Israelites maybe would have planned, they would have been in a lot of trouble. And they would have, obviously, like this is something we talk about all the time, that God's ways are much higher, God's thoughts are higher. But just looking at it from 30,000 feet, looking down at the travels of the Israelites, God knew exactly what he was doing. And being able to look back, like we've gotten to the end of Exodus by 2024. Like we get to look back and see how it played out. But we just see that God knows what he's doing. He's sovereign, and we've talked about that. But he doesn't just do it to make us the most comfortable or to give us the easiest, smoothest ride. God works for his own name and for his own glory. That's exactly why he hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's exactly why he brought the Israelites to the Red Sea, and instead of taking them in a path around, he put them in situations where he was going to be able to display his power. And so we have to, I think a lot of times our priorities or our perspective gets a little bit skewed in thinking of who God is. God is the most glorious, powerful, the highest being in all of the universe, because the universe was created by him, and he works for his own purposes. That is the best thing that he could do, because if he was doing anything else, he would be less than God. So it's just important to remember, as the Lord is taking care of us, as the Lord is leading us, and as we are following the Lord, God is working out everything for his own purposes and for his own glory. Our job is to worship him for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. And he creates the opportunity for Israel to worship him in that. That's great. I think another thing that comes to mind is just the faithfulness of God. He's given promise after promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to the Israelites. He's given the promise that he's going to rescue his people. He tells them that through Moses, that he's going to rescue them and bring them out of the land and punish Pharaoh. And here we see that it actually happens. I think they were worried a little bit along the way as Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says no. And then the people get worked harder. And then these plagues happen and the people get worked harder. And they even experience some of the same pain associated with those plagues that are just kind of widespread, at least at the beginning. But God makes good on every promise he's ever made. And that is happening, really fleshed out here in the story, as God brings Israel to the Red Sea. He provides safe passage across and protection along the way. That's pretty awesome. Mm-hmm. Anything else on that particular question? And if not, let's think about the flip side of that. So we learn a lot about God from this passage. What do we learn about man or humanity in this passage?
Well, I mean, I think probably one of the more known passages from this account is in Exodus 14, when Moses is trying to gird up the Israelites for what the Lord's about to do. And he says in verse 18, not verse 18. But Moses says to the people in verse 13, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." So what do we learn about humans in this story? Well, we just need to be silent sometimes and let God work. And what obviously Moses means by that silence is like, stop your complaining and grumbling and trust the Lord that he will take care of you. Trust the Lord. And so, yeah, I mean, I know that's kind of like playing on, once again, this is an attribute of God. He's trustworthy, but what do we do with that? Well, we trust him. And so that just kind of, leans into a great question to ask your kids. Like, what do you need to trust God with? What are you worrying about right now? What is a hard place that you feel stuck in, like the Israelites were? And how can you be silent and just trust God in that moment? So, that's one thing that it teaches us about us.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's a great reminder for all of us, not just our kids, that trusting and complaining cannot coexist. We either trust God in the situation or we complain about the situation God has put us in, but we can't do both accurately. We can't do both genuinely and faithfully. We're either trusting in God or we're complaining to God and really about God for whatever situation that he's put us in, just like Israel was prone to do, just like I am prone to do, and maybe some of you are too. Very good. Well, how does this event, how does the Red Sea crossing, in a sense, move the story along? Remember, there is a story that God is telling, that God is revealing piece by piece throughout Scripture that is ultimately going to culminate in Jesus Christ. How does this particular event help to move us forward and reveal more information to us about God's overall ultimate redemptive plan for humanity?
Well, what he has told to Abraham back in Genesis is that he is bringing his people to a land. He's going to make them a mighty nation in a great land, and Abraham's offspring is going to be a blessing to all of the peoples of the earth. Well, they're on their way to the land. But what God is doing very intentionally along the way is showing them that no matter what obstacle you come to, he's the one who's going to fight for them, as we've already discussed. He's the one who's in control. They don't have to look around at their circumstances to determine, is God going to be able to carry this out? Is God going to be able to bring us to the land? They just have to look at God and his promises and know it's going to happen. A sea is not going to stop his plans. A 600 chariot army is not going to stop his plans. And so God is not having to, God's not on his heels here. God's not having to come up with plan B every time they hit a sea, or every time they hit an army, every time something disastrous looks like it is in front of them. Israel's learning more and more. Well, some of them learn, some of them just keep complaining. But God is showing Israel that everything that they hit, he's got it under control. He's going to carry out the promise that he made to them. And we're getting there. We're getting to the land.
Yeah, very good. And I think we're starting to see some of that promise fulfilled already. Remember, 70 people go into Egypt. Potentially millions come out of Egypt. When God made that promise to Abraham, when Sarah was barren, that you were going to have a lot of offspring. Count the sand, count the stars. It's going to be more than that. We're getting there. There are a lot of offspring now, and they're all on the move. Throughout this water, throughout this dangerous escape that God is providing for them. That's great. Anything else on that particular point, moving the story along? And if not, always one of my favorite questions, how does this event connect to Jesus Christ? If we fast forward, and these have been some softballs the last few weeks, right, as we talk about the Exodus and God helping deliver the people from a bondage, how does this connect to Jesus and the redemption we enjoy in him?
Well, I would say that, especially here, we're seeing God rescue the Israelites through the Red Sea. And we're seeing, that our God rescues his people in miraculous and mighty ways, and unexpected ways too. And so I think it's just kind of a shadow of the way that God had provided us sinners, even though we deserve death for our sin, that he provided us a way through his son, and that we're saved through Jesus. And he took our place, died for us for our sins, and rose again. And we're seeing God again send a redeemer for his people, rescue us in big and mighty ways, in ways that, aren't really the ways that we would expect to be saved.
Yeah, very good. And so again, the physical is going to give way to the spiritual. Here we see a physical deliverance from a slavery that Israel had really no part in. They were going to be stuck as slaves in bondage in Egypt unless God acted. We, and really Israel as well, all humanity are slaves to sin and are stuck in that bondage unless God acted. And praise the Lord, he did in Jesus Christ. And to go back to the physical story, when they make it across the Red Sea, what's the first thing that Israel does, that the people do when they finally make it to the other side?
They sing a song.
They sing a song. They worship. God makes himself known. He deserves all glory and praise, and they sing a song of their deliverance in Exodus 15. Is that the first song that we see in the Old Testament? I can't remember, but it seems like it could be.
I think it might be. I wrote a paper on this one time. I don't remember anything from that, but
I hope
There's
you
some
passed.
poetry in
I
like
did.
Genesis 1
Yeah.
and 2, but it
Not
doesn't
like a straight up
necessarily say a
song.
song.
Are you going to
so-
sing it? Is anybody going to sing it?
Ready? In the voice of Miriam. No, I won't.
Miriam is later.
I will not sing the song, but we should. Let's write a song, guys, as soon as the podcast is over. But yeah, they sing a song. They worship. What should we do when we think about the great deliverance that we have received through Jesus Christ? We should worship. Maybe that means you sing a song. Right? It's okay. I can't sing good. It doesn't. You think all 2.5 million of the Israelites could sing good? I doubt it. But guess what? They did anyway because they understood the deliverance, at least initially, that they had received. And I hope that you understand the deliverance and how mighty that is for God to come and act and deliver you from your sin that you have received in Jesus Christ. And that puts a little song in your heart too, because it should.
Amen.
All right. So sing a song. Sing a song with your kids, with yourself, with your wife, your husband, whoever you are. Sing a song about the deliverance you have enjoyed as you think about the mighty God of the Exodus and the mighty God of our salvation who has provided for us a Redeemer in Jesus Christ. And sing that together when you're walking, when you're sitting, when you're eating, when you're swimming, when you're in that steamboat going backwards on the Mississippi River, or maybe just by the way.